Greetings. This is States of America by USA Today. I'm your host, Phillip Bailey. On this episode, we'll tackle how the Supreme Court's makeup is a major motivation in the 2020 presidential election as RBG's health and John Roberts' record come into focus. And the intersection of sports and politics has always been a thing in America, but attitudes in the Trump era are changing quickly. The Supreme Court was a major reason Republicans flocked to Donald Trump in 2016. Liberal anxiety over Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's age and health, mixed with conservative skepticism in Chief Justice John Roberts, makes the High Court a 2020 issue. Here to discuss is Richard Wolff, a Washington correspondent for USA Today, who covers the Supreme Court, and John Malcolm, a legal scholar with the Heritage Foundation. Gentlemen, how are you?
Doing well. Good to be with you here.
John, I guess let me start with you, Richard. I've always been fascinated by the Supreme Court and how it does and doesn't often play into presidential campaigns. I guess let me ask you first. Vice President Mike Pence blasted Chief Justice John Roberts in June, saying he was a disappointment, right, to the conservative base. Can you explain why Pence thinks this and what, if any, political signal it means?
Well, there's a few reasons why conservatives are displeased with Chief Justice Roberts, although his record is largely that of a pretty solid conservative. The main reason goes all the way back to 2012 when he ruled in favor of Obamacare. He let the Affordable Care Act remain intact based on a somewhat sketchy reasoning that the mandate in the health law was a tax. More recently, and so that's always stuck in conservatives' craw. More recently, in this past term, there were several cases, one involving LGBTQ rights, one involving abortion, and another involving DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program of President Obama's, where in all three of those cases, Justice Roberts aligned with the liberals. In one of those cases, there was another justice, Justice Gorsuch, with him. But all of those cases are reasons for conservatives to be somewhat dubious of him. And since they are so pleased with all of the other conservatives on the court, not only President Trump's appointees, Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, but also Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito. They still talk fondly of Nino Scalia, the late justice. Roberts kind of is the one that stands out from the crowd.
Right, he's the David Souter, I guess.
Reliable.
Right, he's the David Souter. John, do you concur, I guess, with that, in that Chief Justice John Roberts has let down conservatives, and why?
Well, I think that saying he's a David Souter is going a little bit too far. I think that Rich is right. This does go back to NFIB versus Sebelius. You could have thrown in there the second Obamacare case, King versus Burwell. You could have added in the question about whether to add a citizenship question to the census. So there have been a number of times in which Chief Justice Roberts has, flipped over and sided with the liberal bloc of the court that has certainly disappointed conservatives. And, I would also add a note of hesitation to another thing that Rich said, which is I don't think that social conservatives or the conservative legal movement were particularly happy with Neil Gorsuch, who was the author of the Title VII case, the Bostock.
I was going to say Justice Gorsuch certainly didn't ingratiate himself with social conservatives in that regard.
That's right.
Real quick, both of you, on Roberts. Do you think this is him becoming a liberal, or is he bucking the other two branches of government? He's the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, right? I mean, he in my view, he's sort of saying to the other two branches, we're an independent branch. I don't have to be lockstep with you and your policy prescriptions.
Well, I could take that first, John, if you want. Chief Justice Roberts is, above all else, an institutionalist. He has, more so than the other 8 justices, the legacy of the court in mind. And he does not want the court under his watch to be one where the 5 conservatives go one way and the 4 liberals go another. The liberals are sort of, they are lucky in the sense that they can stick together and nobody sort of calls them on it. But when the conservatives stick together, all 5 of them do. it plays into a storyline that Justice Roberts really does not like, which is we're just like the other two branches. We're just as political.
Right.
So he is always looking either to avoid that. Sometimes he has to move his vote in order to do it, or he's looking for ways to make some of his rulings less sweeping, more incremental, more minimalist.
Let me ask again. Go ahead, John.
Well, I was going to say, look, I agree with that. He's certainly not becoming liberal, which is why I said he's not a David Souter who did become liberal. I think that he is a conservative with the soft C, but I think he's very aware of the fact that this is the Roberts court and appearances matter to him. And I think he is very concerned about how this court will be viewed today and as part of his legacy. And so I think he moves and maneuvers a little bit, taking baby steps so as not to put the court front and center in terms of the national discussion. Sometimes he succeeds, sometimes he doesn't. I wish he would pay a little bit less attention to that and more attention to just calling balls and strikes as a faithful umpire, which is what he pledged to do during his confirmation hearing. But I think the institutionalist label is an accurate one.
Gotcha. Let me ask, let's switch gears here and look at Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Is RBG's age and health as much of a motivation for liberals in 2020 as the court's balance was for conservatives in 2016? Basically, what I'm asking, guys, is what do conservatives understand about the federal courts that liberals apparently do not?
John, you want to go?
Well, I'm not sure that liberals don't understand the court or not. At the moment, at least, it appears to be motivating Democrats more than it does Republicans. I mean, Justice Scalia's passing in February 2016, and that vacancy was very, very critical. It would have flipped the balance of the court. And so Republicans cared a lot about it. And, there were a lot of people who were very, very skeptical about Donald Trump as a nominee, but they cared a lot about the courts. And when they saw the Trump list that came out in 2016, they were mollified by that, in fact, heartened by that. And some of them probably even held their nose and voted for him because of that list. It's a very tenuous conservative majority, if you can call it that, because Chief Justice Roberts does tend to be that swing voter, and having a 6-3 majority rather than a 5-4 majority matters a lot. And I think that, while I wish Justice Ginsburg good health and long life, I think people are aware of the fact that she's unlikely to be around 4 years from now. And so the next president will get to replace her. And there are 3 other members of the court who are 70 or older. And so he may have other opportunities to fill additional vacancies, and that matters.
I think that I agree with everything John said, but Phil, to the reason that liberals and Democrats have not been quite as enthused about the court and judicial matters as much as Republicans in the past is that unlike the Scalia situation, where President Obama would have been able to flip the court from conservative to liberal, the Ginsburg situation is one where the court would go from ostensibly conservative already, to the extent that you consider John Roberts a member of the conservative side, to even more so. And I think it's harder, I'm not sure that it should be, but I think it's harder for the Democrats to make that a wedge issue. Hey, let's stop the 5-4 conservative court from becoming a 6-3 conservative court, even though that would be, in reality, a huge difference, and for probably decades to come. I've been surprised all along that the Democrats, particularly the left wing of the party, can't make sort of a campaign slogan out of "Let Justice Ginsburg retire." I mean,
right.
If President Trump is reelected, she can't retire. Now, we'll see what happens. If Joe Biden is elected, she'll be retiring within months, I would assume.
Right. From my home state of Kentucky, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has certainly bragged a lot about the young conservative appointees to the judicial branch. Do you think part of this, and this is my final question for both of you, do you think part of this is to gird against, if there is a Democratic president, if Joe Biden wins and there's a Democratic-controlled Congress, that at least conservatives can point to and say, hey, look, there will be some guardrails on what Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Joe Biden can do with this more conservative leaning judicial branch?
I mean, you hate to think that there's a huge difference between Republican judges and Democratic judges in that regard. They're not supposed to be political actors, but I do think that it does matter the judicial philosophies of these people, and I think that people who are it could make a difference in the same way that if there's a President Biden and he has all of these vacancies to fill, it will, over the long run, shift how judges look at these cases and decide them. So a guardrail is an appropriate term.
Richard, what do you think?
The age thing has been important to presidents of both parties and to the senators of both parties for many, many years. The latest list, and I believe the previous list of 25, so now he's up to about 44 or 45 on President Trump's list, kind of range in age from barely 40 or 41 or 42 up to the mid-50s. Once you hit your mid-50s on these types of lists, you kind of age out. When one quick note, when President Obama nominated Merrick Garland as sort of a compromise candidate in an effort to try to get the Senate to confirm for the Scalia seat, Garland was already into his 60s, and that was probably more of a concession than his perceived more moderate stances on issues. Just the fact that a president was willing to say, I'm going to nominate somebody that I might only get 2 decades out of rather than 3 or 4 decades was a pretty big concession. But generally speaking, it's not surprising that President Trump, particularly maybe looking ahead to only serving 1 term rather than 2, is trying to get judges on the courts who will be there for 3+ decades.
Right. John Malcolm with the Heritage Foundation and our own Richard Wolff, USA Today. Thanks for joining us, guys.
Good to be with you.
No problem. Peace. Coming up, a conversation with USA Today sports columnist Nancy Armour about Colin Kaepernick taking a knee and why our sports attitudes are changing so quickly in the Trump era.
I think what's happened in this country in the last 4 months has really shifted our way of thinking.
Colin Kaepernick taking a knee. NBA and WNBA players with Black Lives Matter statements on their jerseys, and MLB owners making presidential endorsements. 6 in 10 Americans say pro athletes should use their platforms to express their views, but those numbers skew depending on who you ask. Joining me to discuss the intersection of sports and politics in the Trump era is USA Today sports columnist Nancy Armour. Nancy, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Pretty good. Thanks for asking. Let me ask, sports has always been had intersection with politics in our country, right? I think of Tommy Smith and John Carlos in the 1960 Olympics, my hometown hero, Muhammad Ali, looking to go into the Vietnam War. What's different about the Trump era? Is there a difference?
Well, I like to say that it's not politics and sports mixing that we don't like. It's politics we don't like mixing with our sports. In other words, if it's things that you don't agree with, you're going to have a problem with athletes using their platforms. And I think that's what we're really seeing here is that we, whether it's Kaepernick, the players right now, NFL players, as you mentioned, WNBA, NBA, even some college athletes, these are topics that the president doesn't like, doesn't agree with. And so he takes shots at the people who are using their platforms. Now, he's perfectly fine to wade into sports when it's something to his liking, as we're seeing with college football. But like I said, it really comes down to whether you agree or disagree with the message is how you feel about athletes not sticking to sports.
Right. The whole shut up and dribble idea.
Exactly.
I saw the Washington Post did a story recently about a poll. 6 in 10 Americans are okay with athletes sharing their views, but it changes depending on who you ask. For example, it's 62% of overall U.S. adults. 80% of Democrats are okay with that. 60% of independents. Only 43% of Republicans. What's also interesting is that it skews also based upon age. So under 50 years old, about 70% are okay with athletes expressing or using their platforms to express their views. But when you get with folks 65 or older, it's 45%. Do you think this would be different, for example, if I remember it was Tim Tebow, who certainly is a conservative person, if he were taking a knee or protesting abortion, do you think it would be the same, it would flip, or do you think it would remain consistent that more conservative people would say, hey, look, I'm not watching sports to hear your political lecture about Black Lives Matter or police brutality or any other issue.
It's funny you bring up Tebow, because the people who write me telling me that no, athletes shouldn't, this is not the right time, not the right place, they often bring up Tebow and say that he was not allowed to kneel, which was not true, that he was his eye black, which had a biblical verse on it, that the NFL banned him from doing that, which also is not true. It was actually a uniform violation, and the NFL is quite sticky about those things. So yeah, I do think that we would see different numbers. The most interesting thing to me about this poll was that if you went back even 2 years ago, those numbers were flipped. It was the majority of the country saying that athletes shouldn't be protesting. And I think what's happened in this country in the last 4 months has really shifted our way of thinking. And another thing that I like to point out often is, opinion polls in the civil rights era were not in favor at all of the civil rights protests. I mean, and the numbers were even worse than they are for athletes protesting. And now, fast forward 60 years, and we see those protests as a very righteous thing and necessary in our country. And so I've long made the case that whether it's Kaepernick, whether it's any of the athletes now, history is going to view them very differently than they were viewed 4 years ago, and even how some people view them now.
Right. I mean, I think of, again, Muhammad Ali, who was one of the most hated men in America. Yeah. In the 1960s, when he objected to going to the Vietnam War and died as sort of this iconic figure. And I noticed that too, even about the kneeling, that has flipped from 2 years ago. What do you think do you think it is because of these most recent police brutality protests, whether it's George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, et cetera? Or do you think it's something, is it a rebuke of Trump and his style of politics? Or is it maybe the changing demographics of the country? What do you think is the main culprit for why these views are changing so quickly?
I think it's two things. I think it's, as you pointed out, this changing demographic. And I think it's also, white America in particular has really started to have a reckoning, and a long overdue one at that, with systemic racism. I think the brutal death of George Floyd made white America realize, what? We don't have liberty and justice for all. We are not an equal society. And so I think people are finally realizing that, the protest by Kaepernick and other athletes, it wasn't about the flag. It wasn't about the military. It was about police brutality of Black and brown people. And I think we saw that play out in real life with George Floyd, with Breonna Taylor, and even with Ahmaud Arbery. So I think the combination of that has really been very impactful.
Coming up on States of America, a conversation about our changing attitudes on politics and sports. Has Colin Kaepernick been vindicated?
And I don't think Kaepernick is looking to be vindicated. He knew he was on the right side of history. History just needed to catch up.
Welcome back. Here's a continuation of my discussion with USA Today sports columnist Nancy Armour about athletes airing their political views. Isn't there a negative consequence for this? I saw the Gallup poll that said, the sports industry overall is taking a nosedive in popularity, particularly among independents and Republicans. I see often on social media Republican advocates and activists that I know saying, you know what, I'll maybe watch baseball, but I'm done with the NBA. And I'm getting a little tired of the NFL too, right? I mean, we saw at that Chiefs game, I think it was against the Texans, where they were arm in arm, not necessarily taking a knee, or I don't even know what their protest at that particular moment was about. I think it was just simply to show unity amongst the players, but they were booed. Is there a concern, though, that, look, certain groups of Americans may stop watching certain sports like the NBA, which is a predominantly African-American league, which is probably more progressive than the other leagues in terms, at least, of domestic U.S. policies, not necessarily of foreign policies. They get a lot of criticism from conservatives about not standing up to China and the situation in Hong Kong. But is there a negative to this where we could see people say, you know what, I'm not watching those sports, and it can have a negative impact on those sports industries?
The shorter answer is no. We did see a drop in ratings in 2016 and 2017 for the NFL, but they rebounded and then some in 2018 and 2019. The NFL, they got 4 new sponsors this past offseason when we're in the midst of a pandemic with a horrible economy. NBA ratings have gotten better as the playoffs have gone along. So I think you see and you hear a lot of basically noise, but when push comes to shove, are there going to be some fans who step away? Sure. But you know what? There were some fans who stepped away because of the way that the NFL blackballed Colin Kaepernick too. So,
right.
I think overall, no, if there is any negative impact, it'll be very short-lived. And we've seen it because they were fine in, they've come back after 2016. And I do think we're seeing a difference in attitudes for the majority of the American population.
Let me ask you about Colin Kaepernick, though. I know Roger Goodell said that we should have listened to Colin Kaepernick. I believe you can now play him as a player in one of these in the Madden video game. There's talk about him being in the Football Hall of Fame. Has Colin Kaepernick been vindicated?
Yes, and I don't think we even needed to, for this all to happen, the things that you just mentioned. Nike made him the centerpiece of one of their ad campaigns 2 years ago. I don't think Kaepernick is looking to be vindicated. He knew he was on the right side of history. History just needed to catch up. But yes, the way that the NFL has treated him is shameful. Goodell has admitted that, but yet nobody's given him a job. And when you look at some of the guys who are on NFL rosters these days and some of the guys that we will be seeing on NFL rosters in the coming weeks, it is absurd that still that Kaepernick is not even at least getting a tryout from some of these teams.
Well, Nancy Armour, thank you very much for joining us here on States of America. It was always a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Finally, after the break, we'll look at poll numbers in Minnesota and Wisconsin and why they're eerily similar to 2016.
You'll develop like a herd mentality. It's going to be herd developed.
He failed to do his job on purpose.
A new poll from the Washington Post and ABC News focused on 2 swing states. Joe Biden is leading in Wisconsin by 6% and in Minnesota by 16%. But a Morning Consult poll shows Trump much closer in Minnesota and within 4 percentage points. What do Americans care about the most? Well, the economy and COVID-19 pandemic. Here's what the two have been saying about the coronavirus in the past couple of weeks.
And it is going away, and it's probably going to go away now a lot faster because of the vaccine. It would go away without the vaccine, George, but it's going to go away a lot faster with it.
It would go away without the vaccine?
Sure, over a period of time. Sure, with time it goes
and many
away.
deaths.
And you'll develop like a herd mentality. It's going to be herd developed, and that's going to happen. That will all happen. But with the vaccine, I think it will go away very quickly.
His failure has not only cost lives, it sent our economy in a tailspin. It cost millions more in American livelihoods. This is a recession created by Donald Trump's negligence, and he is unfit for this job as a consequence of it. How many schools aren't open right now? How many kids are starting the new school year the same way they ended the last one, at home? How many parents feel abandoned and overwhelmed? How many frontline workers are exhausted and pushed to their limits? And how many families are missing loved ones at their dinner table tonight because of his failures? It's beyond despicable. It's a dereliction of duty. It's a disgrace.
But remember, in 2016, Hillary Clinton had a larger national lead over Trump in the polls. That evaporated closer to Election Day. Thanks for joining us here on States of America, where we have honest conversations on the issues that matter most.